Okay, so I have a fairly limited understanding of this space in our sport. I think where I've gotten my info is sort of in like the pop psychology scene.
Yeah.
And I feel like myself and maybe some of the listeners are familiar with the central governor theory. You know, this idea that the brain sort of instructs the rest of your body to shut down before you really actually need to shut down. And I've
Mm-hmm.
always been curious, for someone like you that's so rooted in academia, how front and center is that theory in all of the work you do with your athletes?
Yeah, so here's what I think is really interesting about that theory. So Tim Noakes, the South African, very well-known exercise physiologist, had a very esteemed career, also tends to gravitate toward quite controversial topics, this being one of them. In the academic world, I think that we're kind of trained to pick things apart and criticize things and find the holes in things. And I think the theory as a general framework conceptually works really well. And so my lab at the University of Oregon, then at the University of Missouri, we had tools that allowed us to peer inside people's heads and see what was going on in the human living brain, right? Functional magnetic resonance imaging was something that was birthed in the 90s. I finished my PhD in experimental psychology in 1993, went off to my first job, but stepped out of that when this new technology became available. I went up to Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, and we had one of the first research MRI systems that would let us actually see like what's going on in the human brain when someone has a thought, experiences an emotion, has a visual experience of sees something, hears something, imagines something. It was really, really extraordinary. And that was what I did with a lot of my career, focused on really trying to understand the mechanisms of the brain underlying human performance. So Noakes came up with this central governor notion, and it's actually, if you go back and read his papers, he gives credit to scientists in the early 20th century who had basically the same idea. But of course, that was science evolved since then, right? And you've had other people now saying, well, wait a minute, it's not exactly like Noakes described it. But they're arguing more or less about the details, at least from so I was an academic for 30 years. Now I work with elite endurance athletes. I have ultra and distance and trail running athletes. I have pro cyclists. I have a cross country skier, which is my true love in sporting and triathlon and so forth. And, it's, I'm trying to think of the best way to put it. There are issues that would trouble academics about that theory. It's incomplete, and maybe it doesn't predict everything perfectly, but as a working model for someone that is working on connecting brain science with human performance and working directly with athletes, as I do now, it's handy. It's handy conceptually, and I think it's a good guide. We can take the brain imaging data from labs like the one that I ran, and we can identify areas in the brain that are sensitive to fatigue. And it turns out that there's a widespread network of areas in the brain that register physical and mental fatigue, and they take input from areas that are involved in emotional regulation, and they take input from areas that are involved in monitoring our internal body state, interoception. And they're connected with areas that are constantly trying to predict the future, right? And those areas are all involved in computing what we know as RPE, or rate of perceived exertion. So, well, Noakes didn't maybe have the details right, and there are other scientists who argue, well, it's actually much more conscious decision-making that's happening and so forth. I think the general idea is a good one. And I do truly believe, as a career brain scientist and someone who's been involved in endurance sports for since I was a teenager, I'm 60 now, so a long time, that it is the brain that is putting the brakes on before we get to true physiological failure. And I think there's a lot of evidence for that, both research-wise and practically.
And for a lay person like myself, is that car dashboard analogy somewhat instructive, where it's like that my brain tells me that I'm on E, but I'm not actually on E, and someone like you steps in and you're training me to at least slightly override those signals or go a little bit deeper before the tank actually is at zero?
Yeah, I think it's a fair analogy. And I think, I like to describe, often I'll use this notion of we have a true physiological capacity, and we can thank our parents for that, right? It's probably largely set by genetics. And then we have our functional capacity, which is much more plastic and pliable, and we can train that, and we can learn to push the ceiling of that higher toward our true physiological capacity, the point at which we would just come unglued and physiological failure. We're never going to get there, though, right? But there are a bunch of different factors that contribute to how high we will perform on any given day. And that's what I mean by the ceiling of your functional capacity. And some of those are how fit you are. But some of those are also other things that are on a more psychological dimension, either conscious or non-conscious sorts of processes.
Okay. And then I hear and see this a lot where, like in our sport, for example, the best athlete, I guess it's debatable, but I think it's Kilian Jornet. I think he is
Amazing.
the best.
Yeah.
He is the best mountain ultra trail runner in our sport across disciplines. He's incredible. And I think it's easy for onlookers in the sport to credit genetics here. And they will say, yes, he works incredibly hard, but where he comes from physically, there were some genetic gifts that were handed to him. I feel like there's less comfort in also attributing genetic gifts to the mental side of things. And I know that we all individually have a lot of work to do to get better, right? There's so much trainability, so much plasticity. I get that. But would you say that like there are people that you interact with in this sport that also have genetic gifts on the mental side of things, and it's just they can go to places in their mind and access resources that the average person can't?
Absolutely. And coming from a background in psychology and neuroscience, it's always curious to me, and I see it is kind of how we tend to look at the world is there are these physical things, and we can look at somebody being super gifted physiologically, like in cycling today, Pogacar, or we can look at Kilian Jornet in trail running, or we can look at Kipchoge, and we can understand that, like they have something going on very special cardiovascularly, metabolically, neuromuscularly. Michael Jordan, the list goes on. And we're loath to see that that the brain could have similar kinds of individual variability that are grounded in genetics, but it's absolutely true. Think about people who are gifted. We have many instances where we can identify people who are gifted in music, a Mozart, or we have people who are gifted in mathematics. There are these domains of, I guess we'd refer to them as kinds of intelligence where people are gifted. And one of those domains, I think, is kind of physical intelligence. And I think the athletes that I work with have much better, generally speaking, much better than average gifts in that domain. And I also think that these things are trainable and can be developed, and that you can look at small children and see different temperamental dispositions from very early on in a child's life, from infancy really. And certain kinds of temperaments play better to the kind of challenges that we face as competitive athletes, right? So having an ability to self-regulate your emotions and calm yourself and so forth, those are all issues. And like all things, this is on some kind of continuum.
I want to get into some of the work that you do specifically training athletes, but sort of one more, I would say, foundational question. we've talked on this podcast about some of the physical attributes that you need to train to become a great ultra runner. We've talked less about some of the mental attributes that you could maximize to also become a great ultra runner. And if you were to like list out the buckets mentally that you want to train towards to get these people accessing the last, let's call it 1 to 5% of performance, what are those buckets?
What a great question. You're making me work really hard here, Finn. Well, one is certainly willpower. And it takes an extraordinary amount of willpower to do the kind of training that's required for success in any of the endurance sports. It's not quick. It's a long-term commitment to develop your full potential. It's years or decades. And that requires a certain kind of commitment that I would label willpower. And we know something about we know something about areas of the brain that really do strongly appear to be involved in willpower. And one of the coolest things we know about them is that they can be changed and modified through experience, through training. So probably the most exciting discovery in neuroscience in the last 100 years has been the understanding that the brain changes as a result of our experiences. People might be familiar with the term neuroplasticity, that the nervous system is plastic and it will adapt, like a muscle will adapt to strength training, for example. You put it under load, you stress it, you give it an opportunity to recover, it adapts to the demands you put on it. Well, the brain is the same. And willpower is one of those things. We have some indications of what particular brain areas are involved, and it's not one brain area or two brain areas. It's like everything, complex behavior, multiple brain areas communicating with one another. And these areas appear to be very adaptable. So if we're doing hard things on a regular basis, we build willpower, and that willpower then makes it easier to do hard things in the future. And so that would be my candidate for number one, because I would say, and probably most coaches would agree, I would think, that the single most important principle of training in our sports is consistency, the ability to get up and do it over and over and over, month in, month out, year in, year out, decade after decade, if necessary.
We have a number of excellent athletes in the sport who, I don't think this is a coincidence, they hail from the Midwest, and specifically they have these farming backgrounds, and obviously they were involved in the family business from day one. And so to me, it's no surprise that they have this incredible capacity for work in an ultra context after putting in, 20 years since you were an infant, milking cows, the list goes on, right? So the willpower. How about after willpower? What else besides willpower?
I've come to really think that our ability to regulate our emotions is one of these kind of things that is easy to overlook, but is really vitally important for success in competition. And if you think about the nature of an ultra distance trail race, you can prepare for all sorts of circumstances and in your training, and you can try to anticipate all the kind of obstacles that you're going to encounter. And yet you're still going to experience obstacles out there on the trail when you're already deeply fatigued that you're going to have to grapple with. And being able to regulate your emotions in order to solve that puzzle constructively in a way that moves you down the trail is something that really is important and can be developed. And so I think a calm head, I guess, would be another colloquial way of saying it, would be a candidate that I'd put forth.
This episode of the Singletrack Podcast is brought to you by Precision Fuel and Hydration. One of the biggest nutritional shifts for me has been dialing in hourly carb, sodium, and fluid rates based on sweat rate, race conditions, goals. And what I really appreciate about Precision's role in this is that they don't push a one-size-fits-all product. Instead, they start with their fuel and hydration planner, which takes a few minutes to complete and gives you a clear, personalized plan for your next race or long effort. If you've ever wondered, am I underfueling, overhydrating? Why does this fall apart late? That planner is the best place to start. If you want to check it out, go to precisionhydration.com/planner, or just use the link in our show notes, and you can use the code Singletrack for 15% off your first order as well. Thanks to Precision for supporting the show and for bringing some much needed clarity to ultra running nutrition. Where does, and I don't even know what the phrase, where would handling uncertainty fall? Because there's so much uncertainty in our sport. There's so many, it's a multivariate problem when you're trying to do well on an ultra. A lot of uncertainty involved. Where would you fit that into this?
Yeah, I guess in a sense, that's kind of what I was trying to get at with our ability to regulate our emotions and not go to pieces when the unpredictable happens. But, I think that might even be a better way to kind of explain this notion. One of the ways to think about what our brain is doing all the time is it's trying to predict the future. And it's trying to predict the future so that it can anticipatorily adjust our behavior. That's a huge survival advantage for our species, right? And a lot of this big brain that we've evolved is invested in trying to predict what's going to happen next in our physical environment, in our internal environment, in our social environment with other people's behavior. And it's a great advantage if we can anticipate things accurately because we can prepare for them and adapt our behavior accordingly, right? And in these races, it's no exception. We're on a non-conscious level, this kind of prediction's happening all the time. And that kind of big machinery is running in the background all the time that's trying to gauge what's likely to happen in the future based on your past experiences and based on all the information you're taking in from the world around you, but also the world within you. How are you feeling? Are you starting to overheat? Is the dashboard indicating that your fueling's starting to get a little low? How's your stomach? All of those sorts of things are going into this equation. And this equation is being continually computed in the background all the time. And sometimes it jumps into our awareness as well. The brain is trying to regulate our behavior to keep us alive. And when you put someone in a very competitive environment where they're having to really push deeply, the brain is going to want to put the brakes on that. Because the brain doesn't know that, you're at kilometer 48 of a 50K, just to take an example. It thinks, well, if you continue to do to me what you're doing right now, you're going to kill yourself, basically. And so it starts to throw up flags. And the flags could be thrown up earlier as well, right? Because you were talking about the dashboard. Well, the brain's trying to anticipate how much fuel's left in the tank before it runs out. Long before it runs out, it's starting to throw up, hey, what changes with an athlete? Their mood changes, right? You start to get a little low. And for me, and in my own training and also what I've observed in athletes is that's often a sign that, they need to fuel and they need to start fueling quickly to compensate for that. Those predictions are constantly going on and we need to be adjusting our behavior anticipatorily. I hope that kind of gets at what you asked.
This is a major hypothetical question. So if you don't have the answer, this is okay. Because I'm just thinking about all of the data that athletes increasingly have access to, both in training and in racing, all these wearables. I sent you a few actually prior to this call that I think are interesting.
I saw that.
And I'm just thinking at some point, one day down the road, we will have access to a figurative dashboard that actually tells us truly how far away we are from E. And do you suspect that even if we have that dashboard in front of us telling us that we are so far away from E, we will actually have a moment when our brain is trying to tell us the exact opposite, or because we're seeing all that in real time, that signal will be blunted before it even has a chance to activate?
It's a wild thought experiment. I love it. Um, right. Would people actually be any quicker? Would they go any deeper? What would
And
that be?
yeah, and would their brains be able to mislead them?
Yeah. Hmm. Wow. Never been asked that question before. Here's what I
You just
will
made me
tell you.
think it. You just made me think it.
Yeah.
I wasn't.
Oh,
Yeah.
good. Yeah, it's kind of a wild question. Here's what I will tell you that data is a two-edged sword. And one of the things that I do with my athletes is play with data, take data away and make them really get back to feel and really tune into that sense of perceived effort, that sense of perceived exertion without seeing, say, the cyclist is a good example because we have watts, right? Running, I know there's watts, but I just don't think they're not anywhere near as accurate as they are in cycling, where we truly have that measure. Heart rate. We've got all this kind of information coming at us. I think it can be valuable, but I think being too reliant on it is a limiter. It's part of that model of prediction. It's just more information that you're giving your brain. Now you have an artificial sensor that is giving them some kind of feedback about performance, right? And we could think of even other sorts of heart rate is a great example. It's been around a long time. It's not something that generally you and I are sitting here right now. I could guess what my heart rate might be, but I can't really measure it in any direct way. I guess I could do what we used to do, which is just reach down and look at our watches and take our pulse. But it is this kind of non-conscious thing that's being regulated very automatically. We can do things to change it behaviorally. That's a whole other topic. But I think it's really important to not lose the ability to guide your running and regulate your effort based on feel. And so while the data can be really good for regulating efforts and training and things, I think some of the training should be done without that data and should be based on feel in order to keep that tuned up.
Okay.
Because you really ultimately need to race on feel, right?
Yeah. All right. Maybe one more sort of foundational question. Before you get into any training modifications with your athletes, what are some of the changes that you advise them to make and that you see them make, sort of harmonizing their personal life and their athletic life?
Wow. Yeah, that's a huge topic. And I refer to that kind of thing as foundational because if that stuff is not cultivated in a way that is as smooth as possible, the rest of the kind of things we might do are not going to be that impactful. I think that probably the single biggest thing I see with athletes in general is failing to recognize how impactful central nervous system fatigue is on their performances in their training and in their competition. So while athletes will very regularly taper for a race, as they should, they don't taper the central nervous system necessarily. Sometimes an athlete, when I start working with them, we'll get into a discussion about like, well, what does it look like for you in the 2 weeks before a championship? And there's a lot going on. Sometimes there's more going on than in a normal week because there's travel, there are logistics, there are snafus and unanticipated things. But then there are things that they actually do have some degree of control of, but maybe don't take control of until we kind of start to break it down a little bit. For example, we now have close to 80 studies, maybe it's even more than that, showing that if we bring you in the lab and we give you mentally demanding tasks. So not working you physically, but working your brain, working that central nervous system. We can load on a certain degree of fatigue that will limit your performance. So if you were in the lab, you were on the treadmill or on a cycling erg, we could show that time to exhaustion will change. We can show things like critical power in cycling and so forth will change as a result of mental fatigue. This is really important And going into a taper, I think we also need to take into account the need to taper on the mental side. So not taking on things like, wow, I'm not running as much, so maybe I'll spend a lot of time doing running related business if they're professionals, or plenty of pro cyclists will, I will like spend a lot of time doing video games or social media or these things. This is low hanging fruit that people can electively take off their plate. Maybe the business stuff, and the family stuff, those are non-negotiables for a lot of us, right? They have to happen. But things like video games, social media, these are known to generate central fatigue that can impact performance. So if you're cultivating this kind of work, life, training, racing relationship for yourself, really taking serious the need to pare things down and simplify things where you can, particularly in competition weeks. And another thing that I think as they get closer to the competition, taking away some of the sources of data. Like, I don't really think it's good for you in the week of UTMB to be looking at your Whoop. Like, put that thing in a drawer, or collect the data, but don't look at it. Have the discipline not to look at it, because there's nothing you're going to learn that's going to help your performance. And I'm using Whoop as an example, but I mean any kind of tracking of
your
of
Oura
sleep
ring,
and
whatever.
Yeah, ditch it.
Okay.
And I think those things can provide, those kind of physiological metrics like heart rate variability are indicators of what's going on in your autonomic nervous system, which is, a complex thing, but it's a great thing, a great way to measure, but it's not particularly useful feedback during that final week. So it's another way of unloading on the central nervous system side.
So to ask this next question, I'll give you a personal example, and I want to stress that I suspect that it's very N of one. I'm not trying to say that this is how other people experience their worlds, but my day-to-day job is doing this podcast and putting on trail running events. I do also train for races, and I have now found, especially in this last year, that when I'm in a training block and I'm required to do workouts on a weekly basis, long runs on a weekly basis, and really like go to the well mentally to show up for those and to do them to the best of my ability, I find that there is a trade-off with my career work here. Like, I find that I have less ability to prep for these interviews. I have less ability to be creative with our events, all that kind of stuff. And I'm really feeling it now because I haven't trained seriously for the last month. And like prepping for this interview, for example, was just so much easier than I think it would have been back in July when I was in the thick of it. And I think I wanted to bring this example to you because I've always been under the impression that exercise, kind of like in any context, is only additive. It's like good for your career. It's good for your but now I'm starting to think if you're trying to do the running stuff at a high level, it does take away. And am I right in that? Am I wrong? Like, what are your thoughts?
No, absolutely. I think you're right and wrong. Well, I guess you're right across the board. Your old ideas were wrong. In moderate doses, activity and exercise is fantastic. I was talking to you a moment ago about how our brains are capable of changing and adapting and improving in ways like a muscle, neuroplasticity. Well, if you want to upregulate neuroplasticity in the brain, increase things like levels of dopamine and other neurotransmitters. And one of the most pronounced ways of doing that is having some degree of exercise, increases blood flow in the brain, and so on and so on, up to a point. And once we go over that point, what we see very consistently in athletes who are training hard is that they're fatigued, right? They're not going to, if I put you under a lot of complex cognitive testing, you're going to be more prone to errors. You're going to be slower and more variable than you would otherwise when you're in a heavy state of training. Obviously, or maybe non-obviously, if I were to give you those tests, after a hard workout, or in the middle of an ultra, if we could do that, we would see a deterioration of performance. It's pretty pronounced in ultra running. Cognitively, people start to unravel. They come back from that. It's an acute sort of thing, but we're all compromised somewhat if we're under heavy training loads. Our cognitive functions are a bit slower, a bit less accurate, and so forth. Now, if you get somebody who goes beyond the sort of functional overreaching state and starts to truly get into overtraining, which is pretty rare, then we really see things start to tank cognitively.
There's one of the reasons I bring it up, and again, for the record, I am not an elite athlete. I'm like a weekend warrior type, and I call myself a front of the middle of the packer. Actually,
I love it.
Yeah, the podcast does often talk about the professional side of the sport. We follow all the key races, interview all the key athletes, etc. And there has been a vigorous debate in our community about how much any given elite runner can put on their plate. For example, can you balance a really demanding career and perform at the highest levels of the sport? To date, there still are quite a few people that are doing both. And it amazes me because I have always been of the mindset that like you kind of have to commit and you can only do like one or two things well in your life at any given time. So we'll see. I don't know if it's more of a sign of like the immaturity of the sport, and as things get more professionalized, you do have to make that trade-off at some point. But it's a really interesting time right now.
Yeah, no, and it's been very interesting for me as someone who started running in around 1980 to just see trail running become a thing. And, doing trail races in like the late 80s and 90s when they were really ragtag sorts of things to how professional things have gotten. And I think it'll continue to evolve. But if we can't really run the experiment, right? And know like what you'd be like if you weren't training 20 hours a week and you were training 5 hours a week in any kind of rigorous way. But I do think that, and we can't know in those individuals who are evidently juggling like professional careers and racing at a high level, what they would be like if they weren't doing that juggle. My guess is that we all need some kind of stimulation. And I think there are two competing forces here. One is that professional athletes can become very wedded to the identity of themselves as professional athletes, non-surprisingly. The problem there potentially is that you start to really depend on that identity. And competition is one where sometimes it goes well and sometimes it doesn't. And if you start intertwining your performance with your own self-worth, that's kind of a problem, right? And so the other thing is that, having this kind of thing, at least taking up some of their time that's not tied to their sport, even if it's repping products for a company or social media things, I think is very good because it gives them something else to hang their hat on. So there's a balance there, right? But too much of that kind of additional work, and I think they're going to compromise their performance. And it's not just about time management. We all want to think it's about time management. We all want to write the training schedule and say, oh, it's no problem. I'm done at, I get off work at 4 p.m. There's still 2 hours of daylight. I can get my training in. Yes, you can. But it's about the accumulation of fatigue, not only physically, but also, physically in your central nervous system too, which we tend to really overlook.
Okay. I told you we might be all over the place. This is slightly pivoting.
It's fun.
Let's say that I just ran a 100-mile race. And, it took me 22 to 26 hours. It was strenuous. And in addition to recovering my body, I'm interested in recovering the central nervous system and accounting for all of that fatigue. It was a super strenuous experience. Does the recovery for your central nervous system parallel the timeline that your legs need, for example? Or do you have data out there that shows actually like your brain comes back faster than, your quads do?
Yeah. I don't know. That's a great question. I don't know if that data exists. And partly, and I think the reason it may not exist is just because this idea of the central nervous system fatigue being a limiter on performance is a pretty new one. I just don't think those kind of studies have been done where we've looked at where we've taken people after like 100-mile or 100K or something and plotted out day to day, tested them, which we can do. We can give you, very demanding cognitive tasks, and we can, I use them in some of the training I do with my athletes where they're having to make a lot of decisions in short periods of time under pressure, and we're working on developing focused attention when they're fatigued from training. That's something that we do with a lot of my athletes. I'd be happy to tell you about it. But it would be very interesting to track what that's like in, say, the 14 days after, the Javelin 100 or something like that. My guess is that things change a lot quicker in the central nervous system than they do in, in muscle physiology and things, but I don't know.
One of the reasons why I think that could be correct is I always find that in the first 24 to 48 hours post ultra, I never want to do it again. And then 3 days later, I'm ready to sign up for the next one. It's like,
you're looking at the ads. Yeah. No, but for sure. But also you probably had that experience of just feeling just flat, like emotionally flat, mentally it's hard to do demanding work. You could be sitting on your bottom and resting your legs, but the brain often after these hard things is not really able to go in the way it normally would. And that's, I think, central fatigue.
Yeah. And then I would also assume that part of my rationale for hopping back into a training block is because it's what I know. It's the groove that I'm comfortable operating in. And even if it isn't the right thing to do, like you want that predictability or just that like familiarity in your life.
Well, I'm sitting here right now recovering from a cracked femur from a mountain bike crash 5 weeks ago. And I can attest to the fact that when you get out of your groove, it's really hard.
Yeah. Okay. So, but one of the big ideas that you've already mentioned a couple times now is that we do know that it is possible to improve fatigue resistance in the brain. And so, yeah, talk about some of the training modifications that you do with your athletes to make this possible.
Right. So, it's probably been the last 15 years or so. I was mentioning earlier how we probably have 80 published peer-reviewed papers now showing that if we put people under cognitive load, physical performance will go down in measurable ways. We can take you to the lab and we can do that. So it's a very consistent finding. So then the question becomes, well, if that's true, what do we do about it? So one of the things we do about it, we talked about earlier. We start to cultivate a lifestyle that allows us to deload the central nervous system as part of our general recovery sort of plan. But there's been this research in the last 15 years suggesting that we can train fatigue resistance in, let's say, performance critical cognitive functions. And I would identify those kind of performance critical cognitive functions as things like the ability to make accurate decisions, the ability to reason your way through a decision where you've got to consider a number of different things and try to make a good choice. That's stuff you're going to have to deal with out there on the trail. In the ultra world, puts very high demand on that, right? And probably everyone who's ever run an ultra could attest to the fact that when you get deeper in these races, it gets harder and harder to do that. And people do make bad decisions all the time. What about their ability to have focused attention? That's very important in a number of levels. One way in which it's very important is to stay on your race plan. The ability to switch between tasks. These are fundamental cognitive skills, but it's very important to performing, and I would say in any kind of performance, but endurance racing being no exception. You've got to be able to think about what the competition is doing and switch back to what's going on in my body. And there has to be this kind of cognitive flexibility and agility. That tends to fall apart when we start to get tired and accumulate that fatigue. So what I've been doing, based on the research, is starting to pair intensive cognitive tasks. Like I generally program them up and I push them to my athletes on their iPhones type things. And they seem like very simplified kind of games, but they're the kind of tasks that I used in my lab for many years to test basic functions like task switching and focused attention and decision making and so forth. And I can adjust the difficulty of these tasks and progress the intensity of them, put more cognitive load or less cognitive load. We can periodize how we do this, much as you would a training plan. But the key thing here is that I am having them practice doing these kinds of executing these kind of cognitive functions when they're fatigued from training. So what that might look like is you come back from your long run and you're fatigued. You grab a bottle, you put a dry shirt on, and now you've got to muster the willpower and focus to plow your way through 20 or 25 minutes of pretty high intensity, rapid fire cognitive testing where, you're maybe making, let's say 50 decisions a minute, and they're quick, they're simple. But if we were to bring you in the lab and we were to look at brain activity, we know we're getting at those key circuits that are involved in, say, focused attention or these other kind of performance critical sorts of skills. Response inhibition, right? Not necessarily just automatically responding, but slowing it down and having to check that automatic response and override that with a more reasoned response. These things are really important to performance. And the data suggests that we can improve your ability to do them when you're fatigued in competition if we train them when you're fatigued in training. So my athletes are spending usually 3 sessions a week. One might be, like I described, a block of, say, 20 to 30 minutes of very intensive work while they're fatigued from an over-distance workout. But then I also do these kind of more interval-based things where we might, on a higher intensity training day, during recoveries, and we can do this, it's very easy to do on an indoor trainer for cyclists, but I've done it indoors with athletes who are working on the treadmill. We've even done it outside, like at the track, where, during the recovery from some kind of higher intensity interval, they will have to do a 1-minute super intensive cognitive task. And the results I'm seeing parallel what we would expect from the research pretty nicely. That deeper into these races, my athletes are reporting that they're not feeling as compromised cognitively, that they're better able to make critical decisions and stay focused on the task deeper in. And one of the interesting things about the research is it suggests that over time, this training also has the effect of lowering slightly our sense of perceived exertion. And I think that's because as we practice anything, it gets easier, right? So if you have practiced making a lot of doing a lot of cognitive exercises when you're fatigued, then they're going to be easier to do when you're in a competitive state. And our perceived exertion is kind of the sum total of all the different sources of effort and stress that are on us, including sort of cognitive demands.
So I hope this doesn't undermine some of the points being made, but most of the races that I do are multi-day in nature. So I need to account for the fact that hopefully these benefits extend beyond like one circadian cycle.
Yeah.
Can you speak to, like, if I'm going to do this training and my floor of mental fatigue, my floor is going to be higher than it would be without it, how long can I stay at that level? Is it constrained to like a circadian cycle? Can it go into day 2, day 3, day 4? Like, what are you seeing?
I have no idea. And I don't have any athletes who do multi-day events regularly. So I have no idea what that would be like. And it's a super interesting question. And it's just outside of my realm of knowledge.
Yeah.
I still would think that the benefits, at least if we could get benefits that only existed for one circadian cycle, maybe still that would be good for your performance. I just don't know if things would deteriorate that quickly or not. I don't know. And in the wild card here for me is the interaction with sleep deprivation.
Yeah.
This is a great question.
I can tell you're a scientist because you're okay with saying I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I've had a lifetime of not knowing or thinking I did know and discovering I was wrong. So I'm good with it.
It is, but I will say that again, even within our wacky world of ultra running, it's like such a fringe thing right now. There might be like 2% of the sport that does it, but I do think if we were to stay within the confines of like 50-mile races, 100K, 100-mile, like where you're doing it within a 24-hour span,
Yeah.
it is very interesting to me that you could, like, one of the things for me, error recovery. I think about all the times I mistakenly go off course or I miss the gel within like a 20-minute interval, and the ability to like not blow up and think my race is over and get back on the saddle and like keep eating, or get back on course and not feel like my race is over. That's huge.
Well, yeah, I think so as well. And I think error recovery is easy to think about in the context of baseball pitching or tennis serves and things like that, or returning a tennis serve. But I think it's no less important in our sports. It just happens at a slower pace. It's not like, every time the ball goes over the net, there's potential to have to really stay focused and not dwell on the error that you just experienced and so forth, right? Those are just occurring at a different frequency. But in endurance sports, it's vitally important. In cycling and road cycling, and I work with some high level road and gravel cyclists, that's for an endurance sport kind of the situation where error recovery is super important, because it's so dynamic. There's so much of how well you're doing depends on maintaining the draft, which depends on what the other people are doing and you anticipating that correctly. And sometimes you make mistakes and you've got to immediately recover from those mistakes, or you're out the back and you've lost the draft and your day is done. But in ultra running, it's the same, right? Because what can happen is we make an error. We do a bad judgment. We get off course. That's a pretty significant thing. Or we let go of a group that we're in. We decide to let them go. And as human beings, we have this very strong tendency to start to ruminate on the things that have happened, right? We do it in everyday life. We do it in competition. But the race isn't happening in back of you. That's done. You can't control that. The race is happening right here in the moment. And so the quicker we can recover from any sort of bobbles or errors we might have made in judgment or execution, the more present we could be in the moment where the race is happening and not compound those errors. Because, in tennis, in other sports, but also in endurance sports, when we start dwelling on the errors we've made, we're not where we need to be in the present where the race is happening. And that leaves us prone to more errors. And the whole sort of nasty cycle spins downward.
I think this next question might apply to just about everybody, because everyone is trying to get better in the sport. But a lot of times it requires in a race taking pretty significant risk. And I think of myself as a very conservative racer. And as a consequence of that, I found myself in a lot of seasons replicating the same results year over year, even with different training interventions physically in the lead up. Is there anything that you've seen in the literature or through your own work with athletes that you can train risk taking in a practice setting so that if they do it in race, it's not the first time?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I don't think we do enough of it. And let me I've got to make a note to myself here, because there are two thoughts about this. And one thought is getting back to this notion of the brain being a prediction machine. What is a typical intensity workout look like for an endurance athlete, cyclist, cross-country skier, runner, whatever. It tends to be very predictable. It tends to be very structured. Let's just say I'm going to take some low-hanging fruit here and say we're going to do, I don't know, Norwegian 4x8 minutes or whatever, right? Pick something. Well, that's great. And you will get a nice training bump from that if you do it at the right intensity and you do it at the right time and you allow the recovery and you do it, repeatedly and so forth. And that's the job of a good coach. The limiter there, from my perspective, is that you know exactly when 8 minutes is up. So you can gauge your effort with no lack of predictability whatsoever. And yet that's exactly antithetical to what's happening during a race, where you've got to constantly be making decisions about taking risks, exerting yourself harder than you might want to stay with the group, to drop a competitor, to really try to put some space between yourself and the others and maximize. Maybe you're great at descending. Maybe you're great at ascending. You've got to really go deep on those areas to compensate for the fact that maybe you're not that good at the other one. I think we can train this ability by starting to shake up some of these workouts. So instead of doing 4x8 minutes, maybe you do 4 by something that averages 8 minutes, but sometimes it's 6.5 minutes and sometimes it's, 9.5 minutes or something. I'm probably screwing up the math, but you get the drift. But the key is the athlete doesn't know, or you just take time away from them completely. And you say, we set a little alarm. It will vibrate when you're done with the interval. And I think that those kinds of things help the athlete to get used to training under conditions of unpredictability, which is really taking a risk, right? It's this idea you brought up of taking a risk. I'm going to hold this intensity for an indeterminate period of time. And you might know like roughly how long that is, but you don't know if you don't have your watch, right, to tell you. You're waiting for some little alarm to go off or something like that. You're not marking time. I think that's really good because that raises our level of anxiety and it teaches us to perform under conditions of uncertainty.
You might know the answer. I don't know. I think it'd be pretty cool if technology did exist for a coach through Training Peaks or Strava, injecting some sort of mystery workout into your watch. And then you just go. Like maybe there's some vague instructions of like, just keep going at this particular heart rate or RPE scale. And you'll hear a beep on the watch when you're done.
Well, yeah, I don't know if that exists either, but I'll tell you that I do with my athletes come up with ways of structuring that, usually in collaboration with their coaches, because I don't write people's training plans, but I usually have a good relationship with coaches as part of a performance team, and introducing these kind of workouts. There are ways to do it. They're not particularly technical. I'll give you an example of myself when I'm getting ready, when I'm cross-country ski training, and there are certain interval workouts I do where I just set up there's an app. There are many apps out there that can set like random timers to vibrate your phone at, and you give them a window, and on average they'll do it. And you can tell them how many cycles and stuff. They're like Tabata timers or something like that. They're free ones out there. I do that, toss the phone in where I can feel it against my skin, and I go until it vibrates. And then I have a recovery. And then when it vibrates again, I go again. I think there's tremendous potential for doing these kind of things. Risk is a really interesting topic because one of the things the brain is always doing, and it comes to really to the fore in a competitive environment, is it's balancing, it's computing, as I was mentioning, the prediction. What's underlying that prediction that we're doing in the background in our minds is cost benefit sort of analysis all the time. How much risk are we willing to take given the potential benefits? And, we can, there's good behavioral science on this. As people become more fatigued, what happens is that their motivation drops. And when their motivation drops, that's another way of saying that their perceived benefits of continuing at the pace they are start to drop, because it's those perceived benefits and how much they outweigh the risk that motivates us, right? So anything we can do to start to recalibrate that willingness to push a little bit further, go a little bit deeper, it's trainable, right? It is not the case that we can work miracles here, but I do think that we can get athletes who are competing in a way where they're more open to taking a risk and pushing it a little bit more than they thought they could.
This just came up and I want to ask it before I forget. Okay, so the scene is I'm getting ready for a run and I'm putting all my clothes on, tying shoes. I'm going through some dynamic physical body stretches. How about warming up the brain? Is that a thing? Like what does that look like?
Yeah, it is a thing. And it's for my athletes, I will sometimes, especially the ones where we've been doing a lot of this kind of cognitive exercise like I'm talking about, I'll give them a 5 to 7 minute set of exercises that are not fatiguing, but stimulating. And the way I describe them to my athletes is they're like a set of activation exercises. You're going to get your glutes firing before you hop on the bike. You're going to have those exercises integrated in your warm up. And here's one for these kind of performance critical cognitive skills. And so one of my athletes had a picture of himself at a bike race in I think it was in Spain, and he's on the starting line with doing these exercises on his phone, and somebody took a little movie of it and posted on Instagram, and we're like, what the hell is he doing? But why wouldn't we warm these things up? I think there are 2 studies published now that I'm aware of that show that there are beneficial effects to doing that on performance in a lab-based setting. And I think it's a very low investment way to make sure that you're firing on all cylinders when when the gun goes off.
And then if I want to be conscious, if I want to avoid introducing any mental fatigue prior to a key session, how big of a window or buffer should I create before the run? And what are some things that I should avoid doing in that space in order to have as productive a run as possible?
So I'm going entirely not on science here. I'm going entirely on intuition. And this is not practical for most people unless they're a full-time runner, right? I think you need to think about each circadian cycle as a kind of unit of time in this instance. And going into a very hard workout, I would want to make sure that I had a good night of sleep, and I would want to make sure that I was properly fueled up from, going into that good night of sleep. And then maybe the tank was topped off that morning before the workout and so on. And I would want to make sure that in the space of that circadian circle, I hadn't kind of, completely built up a lot of cognitive fatigue during the day. So getting the training done in the morning after a good night of sleep is probably the optimal place to be in terms of the central nervous system fatigue, because you have not had an opportunity to accumulate a whole lot of it, assuming that you were able to deload and dissipate the accumulated fatigue on a night of sleep.
How about like watching TV, social media, video games? Is that like get that out of there if you can?
Yeah, definitely. And that's another reason morning's probably good, because people are less likely to get up, kind of roll out of bed and do that kind of stuff. Although I guess with social media, it could be. I would say there are at least a handful of studies now that show that social media and video gaming does contribute to central fatigue. And then 1 or 2 studies that I can think of that show that central fatigue brought about through those activities can affect physical performance.
Hmm.
So those seem like the kinds of things that we can let go of. And I get it. There are things we can't let go of, right? We have real lives and people have families, and people, many people in the ultra running space are professionals, but they're not necessarily having no work whatsoever other than running. Some are, some aren't. What are the optional things you can take off your plate?
Okay.
For those times you want to be performing at your best.
Does even something like reading a book, like that to me seems like in this day and age of like being inundated with cheap dopamine, it seems like reading a book is good, but would that also qualify as mentally fatiguing and don't do that either?
I think anything in moderation is probably good,
Okay.
right? It's just that we're not so good at moderating. We're pretty good at moderating reading. I think rates of reading are just plummeting in our society. So that's probably not a bad direction to go. You've got to do something, right? But I do think we're really not that great by design, really, right? In regulating our social media behavior, in regulating our trolling through YouTube reels or whatever it happens to be, right? That stuff is built to engage you. And so you need to handle with care, I would say. And video games, similarly, right? These things are really designed to elicit kind of reward responses in the human brain that keep us wanting to do them. So probably handle with care on those.
Yeah. With this next one, I'm thinking about like the conditions that you want to create for yourself mid-run. To what extent should I be like exalting deliberate practice every single run and paying as much full attention as possible to just like the experience of running versus mediating it with music, podcasts, social?
Yeah. Don't have any data on this, but given all that we've been talking about, I think that it's good to cultivate some time without these in your ears. And I get it. You've got a super long day. You maybe you don't want to be alone with your thoughts on a 10-hour training run. I get it. But I think I would try to create space there for just being present with how do you feel? What's going on in the environment around me and so forth? Because I think that cultivates a certain kind of calm, which is actually a good thing and probably contributes to our ability to move down the trail.
Yeah, because I've always been curious about when it's okay to disassociate and when it's not. Like I can imagine I've personally been in situations mid-race where I think disassociating has helped me. Like if I'm talking, if I have that like internal voice in my head, I find that if I'm like in the middle of a race and I'm battling inner thoughts, but then I come up on another runner and I'm talking with them, I no longer want to quit or, fall back from off pace. So I can see how like it could be productive there. But then if I do want to like be a more mentally resilient person, do I practice being in my thoughts on those runs? I don't know.
I think there are times for dissociation and times for really just focus. And I think being able to switch between those two things, and really, I think there are a lot of individual differences here about what the right kind of combination of those things are. And part of the work that I do, as a scientist, we deal in averages. We do group studies, we look at averages, and then we say, well, based on the average data, my best guess is that this would work well for you or would not work well for you. But when we start dealing with individual athletes or individual people, there's just enormous variability. And, even in things like trials of new drugs, pharmaceuticals, there are drugs that are really successful in clinical research. And we say, wow, statistically significant effect on whatever condition this drug is designed to treat. And those drugs then go to market and make a lot of money for somebody. But if you look at the data, it's not like everyone in the study responded well to that drug. And if you look at the data in studies where on average, the drug didn't do any better than the placebo control, there are always people that did respond to the quote unquote ineffective drug. When we start getting away from group averages and we start looking at individuals, as I do now in my work with athletes, we have to be open to this individual variability and that not everything's going to work for everyone and that there's not one recipe. Some of my athletes respond really well to that kind of brain training when fatigued that I was telling you about. But not all of them do. And we have to have a lot of different tools at our disposal. And I think not only on the training side, but on the recovery side. So, we want to give athletes skills to help switch into a recovery mode to get out of that kind of high stress sort of mode and leverage the kind of rest and recovery that they need to continue to train effectively and absorb their training as well.
Again, switching gears just a little bit. Things are coming up. We've talked about all the benefits of this brain endurance training. I buy it. I think this is awesome. I'm so excited probably in my next training block to try to do this thing where it's like I go on a long run, then a session right after with this app and doing a 20 minutes. That's so exciting to me. In your work in this field, have you come across any non-responders? How do you know? How long does it take to figure that out?
Yeah, it's a great question. I intentionally keep the number of athletes I work with pretty small. So typically I don't take any more than a dozen at a time because for me to do the kind of work that I do effectively, I really need to get to know them and really monitor and try different things, some of which work and some of which don't. And I would say that over the past couple of years, since I began adding in the brain endurance training, I've had one or two athletes out of, I'd say half a dozen. So maybe it's like, let's just say like 30% or a third that didn't respond as well. And if we try to kind of autopsy that, part of it for at least one of them was that they just didn't stick to the plan. They just had difficulty getting themselves to do the thing, right? And of course, if you don't do the thing, it's not going to work, like any kind of training. And I would say for two others, they just weren't getting the kind of effects that I would expect out of it, For the majority, I think it's effective. I don't think it's a 10% boost in your performance, but I do think it is allowing them to perform at a higher level deeper into these events.
I could even see it being, I guess it depends on what stage of your athletic life you're in. But for example, I know for myself, from a capacity standpoint, I've always been someone that's trained lower volume-ish. Mm-hmm. And what if I go through all these protocols and suddenly I have like the mental resilience, setting aside the musculoskeletal stuff, to now handle much bigger weeks. And through those bigger weeks, I become just like a better runner. So I don't know if you can like draw the line to that too, but maybe the percentage increase becomes even more because you have access to just like even better training blocks as a function.
That's an interesting idea. I can't think of a direct example to kind of support or negate that. But I would say that I think for way too long, we've thought about the body and the brain as kind of being these two separate things. And if you think about sports science, it's generally everything from the shoulders down or from the neck down. And it's really neglected what's going on from the neck up. And yet that's kind of silly because the brain is what's regulating all of our body functions, I mean, really down to things like heart rate and respiration and hormones and all these things that are essential for all these other systemic changes that training brings about. The brain is in charge of that stuff, right? It is what's speaking to the endocrine system and so forth. So with that in mind, I think that, if you make changes to your physical training, that has implications for the brain. If you make changes to to the way you're training your central nervous system, that's going to have implications for your physical capacity.
Okay. A few other questions before we go. I wanted to. I did write down one thing, and I sent this to you. It was the one thing I sent you beforehand. It direct to consumer neurotechnology.
Mm-hmm.
This is interesting to me. Do you remember? This would have been like 5 years. Do you remember Halo Neuroscience?
Oh, I do. Yeah.
The headphones.
Mm-hmm.
What, do you know why they went under? Like, what was that a real? Like, was that a real thing? Or was that kind of like, like?
So if I'm correct, Halo was a direct-to-consumer product that was trying to stimulate the brain, right?
Yes.
And they were trying to do what we call transcranial direct current stimulation, TDCS. We had research units in my lab for doing a couple different kinds of brain stimulation. And one type was TDCS, or transcranial direct current stimulation. And, the kind of current that comes out of a 9-volt battery is basically what powers these systems. It's like not a lot of power. It's like 2 milliamps or something. There's a good bit of neurophysiological research indicating that if you pass a direct current of low intensity, like 2 milliamps, coming from a 9-volt battery, say, between two electrodes, a positive and negative, it will change the potential of the neurons in the surface of the cortex to making them either more or less likely to fire. It sort of tips the balance a little bit. And the idea is that could put the brain into a state where behavioral training could be more effective at driving these changes that I referred to earlier as neuroplasticity. And there's been research in animal models for the last 40 years on this. There's been human research. We did chunks of it in the lab. These are very tricky effects to obtain, even in a controlled laboratory setting. And I think what probably happened, I don't know the story behind Halo, it's very hard to do that kind of stimulation in a consistent way in a natural environment, because the placement of these electrodes, like even if they're moving a little bit on the head or not exactly in the same place they were yesterday and so on, and I'm talking about by like millimeters, this changes how those patterns of current are going to affect the cerebral cortex, and that's going to change the outcome. So in the lab, we would, have all these elaborate systems. We had like MRI guided ways to place these brain stimulators, and very precise down to the millimeter level. And even then, it was hard to consistently get these effects. It's very hard to do this when you start moving things out of a laboratory. And the devices, I think, that you sent me, I didn't have a lot of time to look.
Yeah, one's called Atlas, brain sensing wearable. It claims to track mental clarity in real time and just generally, again, air quotes, quantifies brain health. Not sure if it's true or not. And then Muse is another wearable, just says working on anxiety.
Yeah. So look, I want to be careful because I'm not familiar with either of these companies or their technology. I'm just going to make a general statement, not about these products themselves, that it is really a challenge to record, or to either stimulate the brain effectively and consistently in ways that will provide a desired outcome. I spent a lot of my career working on that. It's one thing to pull that off in a lab. It's another thing to pull it off when you've got the variables of the real world and people are doing this themselves. The other thing that's very difficult is recording brain activity consistently. So like in my lab, I mentioned the MRI, this $3 million machine that could very accurately allow us to visualize what areas of the brain were being modulated when people were having a thought, experiencing an emotion, solving a puzzle like the ones I give the athletes to do. Complex, non-portable, non-practical technology. We had EEG systems, which would measure the electrical activity of the brain. It's in tiny little microvolts passing through the scalp and the skull. There's all this impedance. These are very hard things to measure consistently. So I will say that probably 10 years ago, we bought one of the commercial electroencephalography systems, EEG, and it was $300. It was super cheap. That system, we would give them some of our, tasks to do and things and look at the brain activity we would get with a high quality system in the lab versus that system. And what we found very quickly is the system was definitely getting signals, but the signals weren't coming from the brain. They were coming from contracting muscles around the eyes and the brow, which are huge signals compared to what you can get coming from the electrical activity of the brain through the skull to some electrode you've got. So look, I don't know about those systems. Maybe they've solved those technical challenges. That would be really cool. But they're big technical challenges to doing these kind of things. So I'm always a little skeptical.
And even if this works, one thing you said earlier that's sticking with me is, and this is new to me because I've always thought like wealth of information, abundance of information, awesome, give it all to me. But you said earlier it is possible to oversaturate athletes even with good data. Like it can be counterproductive in a performance environment.
Oh, it's very, very much the case. So decision fatigue is like a colloquial thing that you hear people talk about, but it's real. Decisions take a lot of energy. And if you've suddenly got 3 different streams of data coming in that you're trying to make sense of and think about the implications of for the effort you're putting out. This is particularly an issue with cyclists because we've got power, we've got heart rate. Now there are wearables to give respiration rate. You could be tracking all that stuff. Plus you've got speed, you've got cadence. Running's a bit behind in that you don't have super reliable ways to measure power yet and so on, but you still got data. And you're trying to make good decisions about like, do I accelerate with the group? Do I hold back? When do I go? When do I not go? You're trying to navigate the trail. You could very easily overload the cognitive system like this. And so that's another reason I think it's important for athletes to train their sense of effort and exertion and calibrate it with this kind of data, but get to spend some of their training sessions really going off field because they should be racing off field, in my opinion.
Last question before we go. I guess this is 2 parts. First, are you optimistic about the rate of progress in this field? And based on that, where do you think understanding about the brain will improve on the nearish horizon?
Well, if you mean in this field in terms of like the brain getting a seat at the table in the world of exercise, science, and performance, I think we're starting to see evidence that that's happening. I think it's really early days. There aren't a lot of people out there doing the kind of stuff I'm doing right now, but I think there will be more. I think interest is growing, and I think the recognition, and really, it's kind of silly that it's taken this long to happen in a way. Coaches all know, any good coach worth their weight knows that there's more to getting the most out of an athlete than just prescribing a really great structured training plan that they're able to adapt to, that the whole mental side of things is absolutely essential to their performance. And good coaches know how to pull the levers and turn the dials to do that with their athletes, right? Academic scientists are a little bit funny. We're very territorial. And so, there's been sort of psychology and neuroscience over here. And then there's been the different disciplines of exercise science over here, exercise physiology and biomechanics and all those things. But I think everybody realizes that that brain science needs a place at the table as well if we're really talking about getting the most out of athletes. And I'm starting to see more evidence of that at the some of the more organized professional team level type things. It's probably happening quicker in ball sports and in motor sports for sure. It's already happening, but I think endurance sports are beginning to move in this direction too. So I'm optimistic.
Are there any particular research topics that you think we're going to get some really like high leverage answers on for application in what you do soonish?
Well, I think this business about what are the factors that affect, well, let me back up. I think this business we've spoken a lot about in terms of what is the role of fatigue in the central nervous system? What are the factors that affect fatigue and its influence on physical performance? And how can we better prepare athletes to manage that in their daily life and their training, but also to prepare for the effects of that fatigue as they prepare for the effects of physical fatigue to get more out of themselves. I think that's kind of that's going to happen and is happening now. But it's just, it's the very start of it. I think if we have this conversation even 3 years from now, it'll be a bigger deal. I just heard a podcast and then I had a conversation with Scott Johnston, very, very well-known veteran coach, incredibly successful. Yeah, right. And I connected with him because I heard him talking about, in these ultra distance events, central fatigue or central nervous system fatigue is such a big factor. And so we ended up having a really great chat about that. But I think there's a growing awareness of this in the community.
Well, Scott, I learned a ton in this conversation, assuming the audience did as well. Thank you so much for your time. Yeah, I mean, any final thoughts that you want to leave listeners and viewers with before we go?
I'm always happy to connect with people if they want to learn more about what I do, or they want to ask follow-up questions. They can reach out to me. My website is cerebralperformance.com. You can contact me via email through there, or you can just send me a note, scott@cerebralperformance.com. I love to connect with athletes and coaches and chat about these things. So, yeah, thank you for the time. I enjoyed it. We bounced around a lot. Hopefully it was somewhat coherent.
That's how I roll. That's how I roll.
I love it. Thanks, Finn.